live! Hello everyone and welcome to Samantha Politics, a show where we talk about global politics and women's rights. We have a great show coming up.
On the military for the genocide against the Rohingya. So
as these poor people are being attacked, people are hiding in their offices. You guys saw a guest.
We're going to be talking about Burma and Russia today, but just a quick U.S. Native American Secretary of the Interior. Now, this is really monumental because
I'm Samantha Karlin, your host of Samantha Politics, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
To direct President Trump to either end U.S. involvement in Iran or seek congressional authorization to continue it. Specifically, the resolution said it directed the president to remove U.S. armed forces from hostilities against Iran unless explicitly authorized by a declaration of war or congressional authorization for use of military force in Iran. Importantly, 4 GOP senators did break the ranks to vote with the Democrats. This whole thing was brought to the floor after Trump requested another $80 billion for the Iran war in emergency funding. Unfortunately, the resolution is symbolic and doesn't hold the force of law. As I was looking at this today, I actually just taught a class on the Powell Doctrine, which was formulated by Colin Powell after Vietnam, evaluating whether or not to use military force, to intervene militarily in a place. It is about war, but it's more so about calculated decision-making that takes into account all of the factors that should be considered prior to employing deadly force. It's about forcing leaders to slow down and asking difficult questions and playing out scenarios before making decisions that can affect or kill thousands to millions of people. The irony of the Powell Doctrine is that Colin Powell is also remembered for standing before the UN Security Council in 2003 and making a passionate case that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. We now know that was not true, and Iraq is considered one of the biggest foreign policy blunders in modern American history. I will give him grace in that Congress had already authorized military action in Iraq in 2002. So this UN Security Council speech was made after the U.S. had already authorized Congress. And he kind of was the fall guy because he was seen as the most respected in the administration. So it was seen people would follow him. That's one of the things that I think makes the Powell Doctrine fascinating, right? It's not that leaders always follow the doctrine. It's that sometimes even the smartest leaders don't. The guy who created it didn't. And sometimes there is conflicting information and tight timelines, and decisions have to be made with imperfect and sometimes even faulty information. But we should do everything we can to make sure the information we have is correct, especially if it's something that's going to affect human lives. That's a leadership lesson. And one thing is I always tell my students is good leaders care more about getting it right than about being right. The moment you become attached to being right, you're not pursuing the truth. And you shouldn't make stuff up. I had a student ask me today, what should I have done when you asked me a question and I didn't know the answer? And I said, say you don't know the answer, but you will do the research and get me the information as soon as you possibly can. Don't make something up. Just be honest. If you don't know, you don't know. Good leadership is not about having all the answers, about knowing where to go to get the answers. And in an age of disinformation, it's way worse to make something up than it is to get the correct information, back it up, and come back with that information. So when we think about the Powell Doctrine with regard to Iran right now, let's look at it. So the first question is, what's our objective? It's having a clear objective. We should have a clear objective before we intervene militarily. What are our objectives in Iran? Is it not obtaining nuclear weapons? Is it nuclear enrichment? Is it saving lives from a brutal regime? Is it deterrence? Protecting Israel? Weakening Hezbollah? Regime change? Regime stability? Securing shipping lanes to the Strait of Hormuz? Women's rights? There might be many objectives, but I don't know if you are. I am not clear on many of them, to be frank. And I don't think the American people are either, because only 23% of them support the war in Iran. And if there's not clear objectives, how do we know then if we're succeeding, if the objectives are murky and fragmented? Next factor, We fully evaluated the risks and consequences. One of Powell's most famous warnings before Iraq was, if you break it, you buy it. He said that to Bush initially, and he was not the strongest advocate for military intervention. He favored seeking a new UN mandate for robust weapons inspections before any sort of military intervention. The thing is, most policymakers are not the people who bear the consequences or the brunt of their decisions. They're not the soldiers. They're not the ones fighting on the ground. They're not the civilians under siege and bomb alerts on the daily. They're not the diplomats who are also in danger and going in and out dealing with this. They're not the families that have to live through the aftermath. They're essentially making these decisions from their ivory tower with very little repercussions, which is incredibly upsetting. So one of the responsibilities of leaders is looking at a range of downstream consequences and taking responsibility for the impact that your decisions have, not just on you, but for all the other people around you, whether it's people in your company, or if you're a public servant, the people in your country, or as a global citizen, the people of the world. So it's not just evaluating, can we do this, but what happens next if we do this? And what happens after that? One of the lessons of Iraq is that our actions there can create second and third and fourth order consequences that no one anticipated. For example, our decimation of the political party associated with Saddam Hussein ended up being the basis for ISIS. There's a great Frontline documentary called The Rise of ISIS, which goes into all of this. And years after Iraq, we were still dealing with instability, regional power shifts, conditions and imperfect parliament, human rights abuses, minority populations being discriminated against and annihilated. So we have to evaluate all these consequences. Strategic leaders don't just ask whether an action achieves its goal. They play out all the scenarios and then ask what happens after. And Emily Horn spoke today, who was on the National Security Council, and she talked about how they would do all of these tabletop scenarios in the NSC and war games to see what are the downstream effects of all these types of situations. And if all these crises happen, what will we do about these crises? And how can we prepare for the next crisis, but also understand the downstream consequences of whatever decision is that we make so that we can make it with a sound head? My partners at Mission Gray, brief aside, have a political risk AI platform that empowers organizations to be able to forecast multiple scenarios, do SWOT analyses, and look at downstream effects. If that's something that interests you or would be valuable to your organization, let me know and I'd be happy to show it to you. So strategic leaders don't just ask, does an action achieve a goal? They ask what happens afterward. Another one of the Powell, have all non-military alternatives been exhausted? This is just hysterical because we had the JCPOA. The JCPOA was not perfect, but it was a lot of really smart people worked on it to create really clear conditions for Iran that Iran did agree to and was starting to, it was starting to happen in terms of Iran had agreed to inspections by the IAEA. And in exchange, the US government, once they were conceding with inspections, did relieve them a lot of sanctions, and as did the international community. So now, after years of escalation and sanctions and conflict and diplomatic breakdown, negotiators are discussing a lot of the same issues that were in the original agreement. Uranium enrichment, which they had agreed to stop doing. Inspections, which they had agreed that they would get. Sanctions relief, which is something we were providing. So it's also, what are the consequences of abandoning the existing strategy before we create a whole new strategy? Is there something that's already in place? And Trump abandoned the JCPOA just because it had the word Obama stamped on it. It looks like the Trump administration didn't even know what was in the JCPOA as they shout from the rooftops similar deal conditions and similar objectives as were in the JCPOA. It's honestly wild. I think part of that too is, have we challenged our assumptions? This might be the most important lesson of all because Powell became associated with the intelligence case for Iraq. And history now tells us intelligence can be incomplete and it can be just plain wrong or shaped by groupthink. That was something that happened, that the national security apparatus was widely criticized for having groupthink, that once it was believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which was initially based upon faulty intelligence that was obtained through torturing somebody and then giving us false information. And the research shows that torture does not actually work to get correct information. It just makes people give us faulty information. But when leaders become convinced they're right, they stop asking questions. So you also have to consider what evidence might prove me wrong. There's a great book called It's either 13 or 14 days, and it's about JFK and evaluating what to do when he eventually did the naval blockade in Cuba. And there was a potential of nuclear world war. And he brought in all different types of people to consult with and to give him all different types of scenarios. But ultimately, the decision was up to him. The decision was up to him. And it shows his decision-making process in deciding on the naval blockade. Another factor in the Powell Doctrine is understanding what are the potential consequences. Have the long-term consequences been fully considered? And also realizing, look, the Iranian regime is horrendous. They have committed horrific abuses against their people. And in December of last year, huge protests erupted across Iran. Amnesty International reports that security forces responded with a brutal crackdown that killed thousands of protesters and had mass arrests amidst an internet blackout. So I'm wondering, where were we then? Where was the urgency then? Why didn't we intervene then? If human rights are our concern, why was there little urgency when thousands of Iranians were being killed, demanding freedom, dignity, and change amidst an internet blackout? I just don't understand why now. The next criteria is there broad public support? As I mentioned, only 24% of Americans believe the Iran war was worth it, the cost, and only 23% believe the U.S. is in a stronger position with Iran today than it was before the conflict. So less than a quarter of Americans believe the costs were justified. Less than a quarter of Americans believe we're strategically better off. And from a financial perspective, according to Moody's, they say the cost of the war is at least $132 billion for U.S. taxpayers and consumers. They have paid roughly $60 billion more for gasoline and diesel since the conflict began, which is an extra $460 per household. When you think about $132 billion, just wondering, could that be spent somewhere we might actually need it on the day-to-day, like subsidized childcare, subsidized elderly care, subsidized parental leave, things that more access to healthcare, greater subsidies for healthcare that Trump holds? Are there things that could be used for that would much more benefit the American people? And the last one of the Powell Doctrine is there a vital national interest at play? Is there a vital national interest at play? So it is unclear what the vital national interest is. Of course, it is always important to limit nuclear development of rivaling powers, because a nuclear world war would be the worst thing that could possibly happen in the world. However, it's not clear what our vital national interest is per se. Then lastly, do we have a clear, viable plan for withdrawal? Do we have an exit strategy? We've gotten to lots of wars. Afghanistan is another one where we couldn't get out. And we were there for many, many, many years. And Afghanistan's another example of what were our objectives. Were we there to reduce opium? Were we there to fight the Taliban? Were we there to train Afghan forces to fight the Taliban? Were we there to promote women's rights? Were we there to promote democracy? Were we there to create an ally in the region? What exactly was our interest in Afghanistan? To suppress terrorism? Also unclear. And our objectives became murkier and murkier the longer we stayed there and the more money that we poured into Afghanistan. So if we look back again at the Powell Doctrine and think, does the Iran war pass the Powell Doctrine? Is there a vital national interest? Meh. Is there a clear objective? Nope. Have the risks and costs been thoroughly analyzed? Nope. Have all non-military alternatives been exhausted? Well, we dumped the JCPOA for literally no reason. No exit strategy. Long-term consequences have not been evaluated. There's very little public support. And also there's very little international support or coalitions other than Netanyahu, who we are... Some say we're doing Netanyahu's bidding here in terms of trying to get rid of Hezbollah. And there's not broad international support for the war in Iran. And all of these countries are now suffering under increased oil prices, attacks on U.S. embassies inside their countries, strained relations with Iran, etc. So if we're looking at Iran today, it does not pass the Powell Doctrine. And next time we do something like this, maybe we should, before we repeat it. Like George Santayana said in 1905, those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it, or are condemned to repeat it. And that's your leadership lesson for today.